Hi everyone. Today I thought I would talk about the ground plane and why I think it has importance to be considered, sort of given a higher priority when designing wheeled vehicles or actually anything that relates to a horizontal plane, whether that be an object that sits on a tabletop, in this case a vehicle sitting on some wheels on a ground plane, and I'll even show you a few things that are floating that still use the ground plane. Here I have a bunch of old sketches here, and I was just going to quickly rifle through them and point out a couple of things that I try to consider. One of the things that you can do with a ground plane is it can provide weight. What I mean by that is you can flatten off the bottoms of the wheels a little bit. And if you do that, if you flatten the tires, it's an inflatable thing. Let's see if I have a better example of that one. Probably this, maybe this sketch. Right here you can see that tire's been flattened a little bit. And what that does is it drops it into the ground, and that tells you that it's flexible. And it takes the vehicle and it grounds it. One of the things you want to be careful of is running your ground line below the tire. I'd say this line is a little sloppy and too far below the tire. I would try to avoid that. This is a better example. So if I have a wheel, what I want the line to do is I want to take something off the bottom. So if you're using ellipse guides, what you need to remember is to just draw very lightly at the bottom, and that will allow you the ability to sort of flat spot the tire. This one's probably good. See where it sort of stops here? I didn't continue the line all the way down because if I did, it would go below that. Whoops, redo that. So I stopped the line here, and that allows me to put a little line there for the shadow. So the other thing the ground plane does is the ground plane carries the shadow, and what you can do with your shadows is you can help to communicate the top view of an object. And I usually draw them just straight down top view lighting and this is what I call like a working drawing, and that allows me to set up the width of the vehicle. I can see that this overall width of the vehicle is a little bit narrower than the wheels. The wheels are sort of mounted outboard, and that makes it much easier to do using that ground plane shadow. It also establishes the rake. I think that I use that for more than anything, and that's the reason I include the ground line almost always in my sketches, is to show the orientation. And what rake is basically the orientation of the body of a vehicle as it relates to a horizontal plane. So in the hot rod world, this is a rake, and usually you have a couple of degrees, and it can be totally radical if you want to do something that's more of a caricature or has more attitude, or if you want to do sort of a low rider look, you would drop the back end, and you can get a whole different feel out of that. So I would say experiment with that quite a bit. Here's another example of the top view, the shadow being used. It also helps with your constructions to tell you where things are ending. So if I draw through here to the center line, I know that's where the vehicle ends. I also know the width here because I could draw it down here on the ground and then project it upward. Here's another one with top view. This one, the top view tells me that, oh, this is very narrow, this bed frame in relation to this outboard wheel position. And the suspension is there. Also, not only does it help you with getting something grounded and adding weight to include the ground plane, but it also gives you an opportunity to show ground clearance. And when you show ground clearance, it helps you to communicate the function of an object. So let's look at this as an extreme. These objects are floating, and I can do that, right, by offsetting the ground plane below the object. And you can see I'm playing a little bit with rake as well. Don't worry about the orientation, you sketch it on the page. You'll see that, right, those are tilted in relation to the page. Just make sure that the line, because you can, quickly grab this in Photoshop and reorient and redesign the page layout. Just make sure that the ground plane that you indicate, right, is a proper relationship to the object that's casting the shadow. So I'll use the shadow a lot as my indication of a ground plane, and the opportunity to get the rake the ground clearance in this case, and also to communicate the purpose of a vehicle. So if I look at these, I'd say, well, this is more for an urban environment because it's quite low to the ground. So it's not going to, sort of run into any real barriers. You also see that I'm trying to flatten the wheels. This is tougher because the pin I used, I would have needed to stop those a little better. These are sitting into the ground a little better. This one though looks like it's more off-road capable. Same with this one, although a big hump, low spot in the middle is not what you want. You'd rather have that high in the middle. You can go a little lower to where you pick up the wheels. But that's an example. Some nice rake indicated through all of these. You can see they're lifting the back of the vehicle up. It's okay to draw, just big general shapes of silhouettes and things, not accounting for the ground line. But I think it's kind of a missed opportunity to just be drawing in here and looking for graphics and things. And then trying to translate this into, say, a sports car shape at a later date. Because when I look at drawings like this, my eye fills in. I know that there's a tendency to only want to do as little work as possible so you can move quickly. But when I look at a sketch like this, my brain fills in the rest of the wheels, and then as a result, it fills in the ground plane. And so what I see when I see drawings like this that are just indication of wheel wells and they're dramatically exaggerated, is that it feels to me like an off-road vehicle because my brain fills in the rest. So just be aware that you're taking those shortcuts. I think most people are aware, but I think there's a missed opportunity when not including the ground plane to show a vehicle, how sporty it might be. So if you start like this and you're always aware of where the ground plane is in relation to the lines you're drawing, I think that's important, because everything, it's going to come back to sit on the ground. So the sooner you start to come to grips with, oh, you know what, this ground plane is always a companion to my object. So if the ground plane is always a companion, it's just like the wheels, it's just like a windshield, right? Not all cars actually have windshields, but you get my point, is that if it's always going to be a part of your design, then the quicker you start to incorporate it into the object and into the sketch, the more practice you have at building the proper relationships of the spacing, helping to communicate the weight of an object on a horizontal surface, and identifying and communicating the purpose of the vehicle, let's say by low ground clearance at the front. This is meant to be some sort of sporty vehicle that drives in, only on freeways and paved roads. So I think it's a missed opportunity not to include that ground line. I know it takes a little bit more time, and we all want to work as fast as possible, but I think it pays off dividends like this to help establish the weight and relationships of your object, whether it be a tabletop surface or a roadway. It will help to communicate. Again, I'm using it here to help demonstrate the width. And, I see the wheels are clearly outboard. That makes it a little bit easier for me to understand. This is very narrow through the middle. Here's some that I just drew last night. And you'll see that I'm really using that strong ground plane to not only flat spot the bottoms of the tires to increase the weight, but also to set up that rake, which in the context of doing something like a hot rod is really, really critical. And it doesn't have to be cars, it could be wheeled vehicles, or legs in this case. So these mechs, there's a little indication of a shadow is enough, but it helps to set the attitude and orientation. And that's my number one go-to element, and I consider it a really critical design element, almost accompanying all the objects that I draw. And I try to use it effectively to communicate those sorts of things. So again, weight the rake and orientation of an object, ground clearance, which helps to communicate the vehicle purpose. It also adds realism. Once we start to see a shadow, we start to believe it, that it's in an environment. And the last thing I would touch on is human scale. If you look at all of these sketches, they all have a human. And they could be fully autonomous and be without the human, of course, but the reason I'm adding the human is that it adds scale. And I believe that it helps us to relate to the object by scanning the image and finding a human somewhere. And if your design doesn't call for that because it's an object, that's fine. You can find other elements that are familiar to indicate scale. So I like to use the human a lot because I think it makes it much more interesting. You can also imagine yourself in that vehicle much more easily, but you could easily just put the person out here to the side. Or I could find another common element related maybe to the object. Say it's a tabletop object and I need to communicate scale. Well, these AirPod cases are quite common now. Maybe I draw something like that, or I draw a marker next to my object. We all sort of generally know the size of that, or a pencil is probably even more familiar to everyone, and those sorts of things. Or money is also good, like a coin can communicate quite clearly, or a coffee cup. Even though can come in different sizes, just like humans, it does give you something to anchor and relate back the scale of your object. So that was it for today. I just wanted to point out some thoughts and how I use the ground plane in almost all of my drawings to help with those design elements. I consider it to be a pretty integral part of my design process, not only to help me calculate and figure out perspective constructions, but also to hit at those points I mentioned. So I hope that helps you in your own work to just consider the importance of the ground plane and how you can use it to great effect as a design element, let's call it, or think of it as a positive, as a way to accomplish all those other goals, which are difficult to do if drawing just the object floating. That was it for today. Everybody have a great week and stay safe. Bye-bye.